Everybody, and good afternoon, and welcome to the first of Res Publica's series of seminar stroke webinar events where we discuss the issue of poverty and inequality and the new conservative response to that and to those issues. The hashtag for this event is hashtag Tories Against Poverty, which I hope you will agree is arresting as it is potentially thought-provoking. And that's what we wanted to do during these events, is gather friends and colleagues from across the range of political spectrum in the party and ask them what their ideas are to address not just those of deep poverty, but certainly those, but also those at risk of poverty. And what sort of new ideas can we have for this period when the Conservative Party has shifted to becoming the party of the working class? And I think it's fair to say that the policy cupboard in terms of the offer for constituencies that previously voted Labour is relatively bare. It isn't clear that we yet have an at-scale idea for meeting the needs of the new voters, the new electoral base of the Conservative Party. Indeed, we can discuss what their needs are and how we might benefit. No one, I think, disputes now the levels of inequality, poverty, or inequity, if I might put it like that, in the UK. We have some of the widest levels of inequality in the world, not least because of our economy and our opportunities are so centred around London and the southeast. And class, which nobody talks about now, except some Conservative MPs, it must be said, remains our biggest penalty, way bigger than anything else. And class has metamorphosized with place. And so now we have all manner of place-based come class-based penalties. So much so that the level of distinction or difference between some places in the United Kingdom versus places, for instance, like between Blackpool and Richmond, mirror those between East and West Germany, mirror those between the poorest American states and the richest parts of America. So these are the issues that we have to address, and we have to address them in the light of the reality that we face and the context of the new settlement that's emerging and the new ideas. And I think it's fascinating to try and ask the big questions. You know, if one was sitting back and saying, what are the biggest innovations that have moved public policy in terms of operating against poverty in this country for the last, I don't know, let's say generations, some 20 years, what would they be? I often fear that the Conservative administration since 2010 favoured too much microtype interventions for very small groups of people who are identified as being on the margins, but they passed away like mist in the morning when the first rays of sun struck them. They have made no discernible difference at all. Whereas what has clearly made a difference, what has clearly shifted the dial at scale are things like, for example, compulsory enrolment in pensions, things like the minimum living wage, which structurally changed the outcomes for millions of low-paid workers and people. Things like, I mean, there's much dispute and discussion about the pensions triple lot, but it has had the effect of eliminating, to a large extent, pensioner poverty. So what are the comparable ideas that we can think of at this moment in time? Could it be something like a revival of the child trust funds? Remember them, abandoned by the Osborne-Cameron government in their first year. The single most successful savings schemes for the poor, that was a match savings scheme from the government. Can we look at things like inheritance tax? Can we look at things like the impact of quantitative easing and how it's massively accelerated the gains of current asset holders? Can we look at things like housing? the most widely distributed asset, but therefore also oddly one of the greatest gaps between those who have housing and own it and those who don't. So we're at a very interesting point, I think, in conservative thinking and conservative policy. It's very clear that the old settlements, whether one agreed with them or not, are no longer fit for this new age that we're in. One might also argue that Brexit has played out quite differently. If you listen to the radio this morning about the shortage of workers, if there's ever anything designed to push up labour and the price of labour, it's Brexit. And all of those who argue that EU workers made no impact, the evidence looks quite firmly against them. So we are in a new paradigm. We do have a new Conservative Party. We have a Prime Minister that rightfully, in my view, has abandoned austerity. We have a state that has made a substantial difference during the COVID emergency. But what can we do post-COVID? What can we do at scale that would make a difference? Now, there's some kind of interesting points, I think, that we need to address and recognise if we're interested in these two things, poverty and those at risk of poverty. The recent work by the Social Metrics Commission has identified some worrying factors, that those in deep poverty, defined by them as 50% below the poverty line, has increased from 2000 to 2001. 1.3 million more Britons experience deep poverty today than was the case 20 years ago. That's currently 4.5 million people are 50% below the poverty line. Largely, poverty for those levels above has remained 1 or 2% the same. The other great mark of poverty is if you have children. The largest rise has been in the percentage of working families with children, or if you have a disability. This is concerning. How can it be for a series of conservative administrations that the penalty for having children is quite so high and quite so pernicious? The same with being disabled. Anyway, I could go on, but I recognize my 10 minutes are near to an end. But I think what we should do today is ask deep questions about can we have a settlement that secures people? Because we live in an age now of new monopolies, enormous concentrations of corporate wealth. When the Conservative Party has done nothing on competition policy, nothing in terms of breaking up these big monopolies, and in places like in scenarios of gig workers, has allowed those concentrations of corporate power to exact great wage penalties on people who arguably need not experience them under a different form of governance or a different set of principles. So that is what the type of thing we want to address.